I'm going to invite my friend Randy Ray to come up, and she's going to be leading the next panel, who is amazing, and I'm so looking forward to their perspectives this morning. So let me go out to Randy and welcome.
Minogajab, good morning. I say it a little bit differently than my dear friend Saga, and I was taught by one of my elders, Barney Batiste. He says, Minogajab, you can say Minogajab means good morning. Good morning. How are you doing? Minogajab, good stuff. Language is so important to who we are as people. All right. Great. So, ani kenawea, ani bojo. So, giwede nodenque indigena cause. Flying Post, Minwa, Red Rock, Minwa, Naswakmonk, Dunjiba. So my name is Randy Ray. I am a Anishinaabe from Flying Post First Nation. I grew up just about an hour east of Thunder Bay in a beautiful community called Red Rock. And my First Nation is actually just outside of Timmins, and we're from Treaty 9 territory. So I'm very humbled to actually live, work, and play in this beautiful territory in Robinson Huron Treaty territory. I'm not from here. And I take that very seriously. And it's a big responsibility as an Anishinaabe person that's not, again, from this area and territory. And Saga, you spoke to it a little bit this morning. And one of my responsibilities, I couldn't sleep last night, actually. And some of you would say it's probably because you went to hockey and you were up late, which it was. And I was still going, but I had a hard time a little bit because of that story. I'm a storyteller. I come from a long line of storytellers, and really trying to. I was thinking about all of the stories of the Anishinaabe, Tikmishing Anishinaabe people, the Wanapate people, and how their stories could have been really woven and continued into that narrative. And it wasn't intentional. Franco had a great story. Who was there last night? Maybe just a show of hands. Who was there? Okay, lots of you were there last night. So it was a beautiful story as we shared, but I think that what maybe was missing was that, that intentionally or unintentionally, Indigenous people have been left out of this dialogue and this conversation. And that has to do with colonialism. That has to do with our people being continuously erased from these dialogues and this conversation since that 1492 that we were talking about earlier. And there's a really important point here in sharing that if the people in this room, if you haven't done your learning, I mean like your real learning, that Debwewin, and that's the reason why the elders in the TRC said truth before reconciliation, is that we really need to understand that Debwewin, that truth, what happened, and how that erasure of those stories need to be in it. So I love that call to action, Saga, this morning of saying, how do we include the voices of my friends at Atikmashing and Wanapate into that dialogue, because that's a story I think that we would all love to hear. And so I always start, we're talking about the environment this morning, and I have a slide, I think, of a little bit of my family. So I'd like to think in generations as well before we get to this beautiful panelist that's here today that has a lot of great things to share. But I know in my area and territory, I don't know if it's coming up. That's okay. I'm very patient and kind. That's who we are as Anishinaabe people. That's who we are. But I wanted to share this picture because usually, and one, I told my grandpa that I would always do this. The handsome gentleman on the right is my grandfather, Sylvester Ba. He's in the spirit world. When we say Ba, means they're passed into the spirit world. And he was a hunter. He was a trapper. His father was a hunter and a trapper. And he grew up on the land. He knew every river, every stream, brilliant ways. And last night I was thinking he would have loved to be a part of like that regreening in our area because he knew. And he taught me when I was little, I knew how to check if I caught a pickerel or a walleye. I knew if it was having babies in it and to put it back. I knew if it was raining, we should maybe go in this lake. We knew for generations, we wanted to ensure that sustainability to make sure that our land was one that we could go on. And he was absolutely brilliant in his approaches. And in our territory, we talked a little bit about the Waban model. What happened with my grandfather is even though he attended no formalized education, he really encouraged my father to go to school. The second man in that picture is my father, Gima Murray Ray, Chief Murray Ray from Flying Post First Nation. He's been a chief for almost 30 years. And what we've done intentionally, and you've heard of this, is ensured that any conversation that's happening in our area and territory, we are there. We are at the forefront. We are having these conversations. Cote Project is in our land, in our territory, and I have my friends here from Matagami, and that's our shared territory. And we work together, our nations, we work together to make sure that we are creating these sustainable models for our environment and for the future. And so that's really intentional and practical. I often joke that I only got a PhD to tell people that you don't need a PhD and we should listen to the men on the other side, which is true. But here I am now, 2 generations in, creating sustainable businesses and models and working with our nations to strengthen our capacity to change this conversation and move forward. But everything we're doing, and all the panelists that I've had the benefit of chatting with already today are doing this. So our people are doing this, and it's for the next generations. And what I think is going to be really important with this panel and this conversation is to really talk about that and use those practical examples and that Debwewin of things that we can tangibly be doing. Because again, with the story of last night, it was unintentional awareness, but we need to make it forefront that we're having these conversations intentionally from the beginning. And having our people there. So miigwech for that. And I'm just really excited to have this conversation with these panelists about these environmental impacts and where we're moving forward and how important it is to have those local actors at the beginning that we heard from Gima Nuchatai this morning. And I know that if Gima Rock was here, he would say the same thing. And so I've had the opportunity to meet with Beth already. Jenny Lou is incredible. And also Martin and Pam, who's here, who will have some translation with her as well, miigwech. And I'm just really excited for this morning. So Beth, I would love the opportunity to have you kick us off to talk about how we can do this and what this actually looks like for us. So miigwech.
Thanks, Randy. I had the privilege of meeting Randy this morning. She came busting into breakfast and found me, and I feel like I found a best friend for life in the first 15 minutes of us interacting together. So I'm so glad that I can be on this panel. I'm so thankful to the OECD for inviting me to come and speak on behalf of the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, or how we lovingly know her as IRMA. And I will speak about IRMA in a moment, but I want to give a shout out to Mario because he went off script yesterday. And I've said to a few people this morning, I've totally thrown my notes out based on the conversations we've had yesterday. And we're just going to talk, and we're just going to have a conversation right now based on what we have heard. And I think one of the things that when Randy and I were speaking this morning, and I was speaking with a couple colleagues throughout this, the last day and a half of being here, it came down to very similar things. It came down to the idea of the regreening project here in Sudbury. It came down to what is the Indigenous participation on the environmental front. Even when seeing this panel, it was a bit overwhelming. Coming from a white perspective, I come from a colonialist lens. I was brought up in a colonialist society. I have been very privileged to work in this industry, generate my own wealth in this industry, and it very much comes because of who I look like, who my family was, and what I was born into. And that is not the reality for so many people in this country, particularly Indigenous nations. And I have this love for mining and love for this industry because, to be quite frank and quite honest, if I didn't get into this industry, I actually probably would have never learned about Indigenous history in the way and the depth that I have. And so I am forever grateful and appreciative. And I always like to share the way that I started my journey of learning and unlearning what I didn't know was kind of embedded in me was when I was flying back from a mine site about 8 years ago, 7, 8 years ago at this point. And I was in the Thunder Bay airport, and I picked up the book, Seven Fallen Feathers from Tanya Talega. And I thought, well, this will be a good read. I like reading. I'll read it on the way home. And it changed my life. I was reading this book, and I was bawling in the airplane because I had just come from the communities that were named in this book, and I had no idea about what the history and the challenges that those communities were facing. I had sat there, I had talked to them about the mine, I had talked to them about what we wanted to do, we had talked about our IBAs, we had talked about all of these things, but I did not know the depth of what those communities were facing and the impact that mining has on that, both from a social perspective as well as an environmental front. And so when we were listening to the story last night, again, I think we can all agree, Franco did an amazing job telling that story. Seeing the changes in Sudbury over one generation was incredible. And when I was going to sleep last night, I just kept thinking about the comment that he made when he said, you know, we are working with elementary and school age students because we're already seeing people forget what Sudbury was like. And I thought, how many generations of knowledge and history do we as a mining industry not know about? Have we forgotten? Have we ignored when it comes to environmental stewardship from an Indigenous perspective? Indigenous people have been here for millennium. I think Dawn said it so well yesterday when she was talking about being rights owners and being the ones who are responsible for the land. Regardless of how long our life of mines are, we will leave. We get to leave whether the fish have come back to the lake or not. We get to leave whether the reforestation has happened or not. First Nations communities are here and they live on this land and are stewards of this land, and we need to be so intentional about bringing them forward. And I think one of the reasons why there's not a lot of Indigenous inclusion, particularly in the 50s, 60s, 70s, when mining was really picking up in Canada, is because mining companies didn't have to engage. There was no obligation to. We didn't have to care about our neighbors. We didn't have to care about what was happening. And thankfully, over the decades, that has rapidly changed, and we are seeing the benefits of what inclusion and true participation actually looks like. And I think when we look at the environment, you know, we can make all the money in the world if we are scorching the environment, if we are destroying Mother Earth where we are living, then what good is it anyways? And so I think I am not the one on this panel to speak about the Indigenous knowledge and what should be incorporated. I got a glimpse at Jenny's presentation. Randy gave me a little sneak peek, so I'm really excited for Jenny to share about what she's doing. But I just want to make sure that from my lens and my perspective, that it is our obligation as the people who are settlers in this country, as the people who are responsible for these companies, for our policies, for our practices, that there is no more excuse for unintentional bias. We have to actually think from everyone's perspective. Everyone has to be at the table. And I think kind of bringing this all back, because I obviously need to share about what we do, is working with IRMA. One of the things that IRMA has done really well, so IRMA is a mining standard. It's a third-party assurance process that is global in nature right now. We have over 100 sites implementing IRMA globally. We have 32 different minerals and commodities, or minerals and metals, that are represented within the IRMA system. And how IRMA is different than the other assurance processes that are out there is that IRMA took 10 years in the making to actually establish. And the reason for that is because IRMA immediately took an equal governance approach, where it was built from six different stakeholder groups. So we have our downstream customers, we have investors, we have the mining company, we have affected community, civil society organizations, and labor unions. And they all came to the table way over a decade ago to say, we want more responsible mining practices, but we all want our voices heard in an equal manner. And it took IRMA, as you can imagine, with those competing priorities, 10 years to get to a standard that everyone agreed upon. Is IRMA difficult? Yes, IRMA is difficult. It's probably the most difficult standard out on the market, and that is what the mining industry needs. We need to be pushed, we need continuous improvement, and we need to ensure that every voice has an equal say. And I think some of the areas that have been the most contentious when we look at the standard landscape are around water, waste management, and FPIC. And IRMA right now is the only mining standard in the world that requires that FPIC be obtained. It is not that FPIC is sought. It's not that you seek FPIC and you get to decide when consultation is enough. You actually have to obtain it. And I think Mario said it so well yesterday when he said, stop waiting for someone to tell you what to do right. And that is what IRMA is doing right now. They put out a standard that is hard, that is unknown, and that no one has done before, because they continue to say from our stakeholder groups, We need to do better, and we need to ensure that everyone who is affected by the mine and by mining projects has an equal voice and equal say. And so that is one of the benefits of working with IRMA when looking at what does Indigenous inclusion look like, not just here in Canada, but globally, is that we make sure that there is that equal voice and that every company that goes through that third-party assurance process, their communities and stakeholders are actively involved in that auditing process to make sure that their voice is heard. So I will stop there because I think I have shared enough, but very much looking, hi Carlos. I met Carlos last night driving home from the dinner with Krista from I Am Gold. So we had a great conversation about Peru. And I rambled on about Irma as well. But I will let the other panelists take over from here, but I'm just very grateful that I was able to speak and share with you today.
Miigwech. No, that was great. Miigwech. Beth, I think you brought up a really great point, and it's something we were talking about earlier around that kind of learning and unlearning, and I love that we share that similarity. There's a concept in Anishinaabe that I was taught by Ryan McMahon. It means to look back in order to look forward. And some of the things that you're talking about are systemic, and systemic things are really interesting because we don't see them, but they're so embedded into the systems. Does anyone know in this room in what year Indigenous people were allowed to attend post-secondary education in Canada? Anyone know? Close, 1960. It was actually the same year we were allowed to vote. We still couldn't own businesses at that time. So our entrepreneurs in the room, in Gima, we couldn't own those things. So those systemic things that we don't really understand with the Indian Act that's still in place, the only race-based legislation left in the developed world, these systems are actually the pieces that really tend to hold a little bit of us back, but we're moving forward. So I say, despite all these things that were happening, how much we're thriving, how many brilliant Indigenous people are in this room, how many communities are doing incredible economic things that we're going to talk about with Jenny Lou right now. This is part of it, but if you don't understand how far we've come in this short period of time, it's very difficult to understand how to context set that piece. So Miigwech for your brilliant thoughts. And are we going a little rogue? Are you going next, my friend? Or Martin's going next? So we're going the same. Perfect. Okay, let's do it. Jenny Lou, you're going last. Great. All right, so my friend Martin is going to speak now, and really looking forward to him sharing. And again, Miigwech, Beth, for your brilliant insights.
Thank you so much, and really I like the way you say my name, so Canadian.
Oh yeah, sorry.
So that's really great. I was first going to go there and speak because I was a little bit afraid because I work with the International Labour Organization. That's a UN agency that is working on employment, workers' rights. So I was a bit afraid to come to the mining industry because we also uphold the right to strike in the ILO. So I said I'm going to go there behind the thing. So,
Yes.
but I think it's also because it's a bit more convenient. I can see the slides. Thanks so much to everyone. It has been a wonderful journey, the conference, and I think we are now in full swing, and I think that the discussion is deepening, and I think it's great to enter at this stage also because I work at the international level in a UN agency that deals with social issues, labor issues, employment, but we have also the issue of Indigenous peoples on our agenda, which has long seen as a bit of a historic relic in our work because the ILO has been working on Indigenous peoples issues quite for a while, actually, since the 1920s. I had to say that because we were founded in the League of Nations. Now the OECD is the Marshall Plan. We're a bit older. We come from the League of Nations, but we have gone also through quite of a development, and that is also there has been a development how we deal with Indigenous people's issue, because we came to the issue when the world was really a colonial system, and when people started to think about that they need to do something to deal with forced labor in the colonies, in the 10 colonies, and their realization was we're talking actually about Indigenous peoples that are the main victims of forced labor. And this is how, as a labor organization, we came to that, and in 1957, a first international instrument was adopted, saying that all countries and the newly independent countries have an interest to address the situation of Indigenous peoples, and you can't address labor issues in isolation. You need need to deal with this comprehensively. You need to talk about working, living conditions, land rights, cultural issues, and so on. Of course, this older convention is outdated. It was revised because it was basically the idea, we're going to assimilate you, and once you're going to be like the rest of us, your problems will be solved. This was the idea of 1957, and a new convention was adopted in 1989. This is Convention 169, which is still the only international treaty that exists on the matter. Now it's complemented, and with the UN Declaration, which is the latest, the most aspiring instrument that we have in the UN system. The two are really are compatible and mutually reinforcing. The UN Declaration is really also stating the right to self-determination, which in the ILO we haven't dealt with because we said this is for the UN to regulate, but they're mutually reinforcing. And I'm just wanted to highlight a few of these elements that are still very relevant in Convention 169 because it's also ratified by 10 countries that are members of the OECD, including 6 countries that have indigenous peoples themselves, but also by countries they don't have indigenous peoples, but it's because they're committed to promoting respect for the rights of indigenous peoples worldwide. So I think the OECD group of countries has a unique opportunity also because there is a rich diversity, not only of about how countries set up, where they are, in which part of the world, but also because indigenous peoples are making in these countries a lot of contributions to understand these issues better. So the ILO is working in the mining sector also from different perspectives. We promote occupational safety and health, decent working conditions. That's our core business. But what brings us here, thanks also to the invitation, is to talk a bit more about our role and work on indigenous peoples issues and how that contribute also to the larger promotion of indigenous peoples' rights and well-being. We do a lot of research, and we have issued a report in 2020, which has come up for the first time with a global estimate of the number of indigenous persons over the world, and it's 476 million. India, for instance, is the largest country with indigenous peoples. That these are peoples that are not referred to as indigenous in their country, but many of them self-identify as indigenous peoples, and they fall within the international concern of indigenous peoples as we define it, also based on what Convention 169 and the UN Declaration says. So this is an issue that is crosses over the world. We have African countries that have indigenous peoples, many countries in Asia and in Europe also. We have heard from Stefan from Sweden, for instance. So Norway is a country that has actually ratified Convention 169. What is very striking is that indigenous peoples, irrespective of the income level of the country, high level, medium level, or low level income country, the indigenous peoples are always part of the poorest of the poor. And this is very much also borne out by what the labor statistics say in terms of high level of participation of informal work with no social security. It's often work at the elementary occupations level, and that is irrespective of the attainment of education. We see also inequalities in education, but even people that have education are low represented in the qualified occupation. So there is an issue that was mentioned by the speakers also of discrimination that is often of a systemic nature, and that often goes unnoticed. And we deal also, of course, with these issues. But these few numbers are quite striking to say that indigenous peoples often come from a very vulnerable position to the labor market, and it has also to do with the capacity that communities need to build up to deal with the broader issues they face. And so I think one of the messages that we really can give from Convention 169 is that even in the ILO, much of the attention that comes to us is about mining, because actually in many countries, the mining ministries and the industry is very much interested in the convention. But the convention is not only about participation and consultations. In our convention, it's consultations, but consultations that in good faith should lead to agreement or consent. The declaration goes a bit further in articulating that differently. But what we are saying is that if you want to reach agreement, you need to also have a path to go there. So consultation process is very important. For that, you need to, as a government, you need to build up your own institutions to do that, and you need to also support indigenous peoples to build up their own institutions. There is a specific guidance in the convention that says that resources should actually be made available to indigenous peoples to build up their own institutions. So this is one of the issues. But I just listed a couple of things that are there, but we have also health, education, and other issues in the convention. So it's really a holistic approach, but I like these two quotes from the preamble, which really fit to this panel, where it says, indigenous peoples should have the right to control and their own institutions, ways of life, economic development, while maintaining and developing their identities, languages, and religions. And as early in '89, it sounds almost like visionary that at that time one highlighted, the negotiators already highlighted contributions of indigenous peoples actually to cultural diversity, social and ecological harmony of mankind. These were the words chosen in 1989, and today everybody speaks about that, of course. A few other features are, when we speak about consultation participation, that, and that is often when we work with governments that want to build up their own capacity, is that there needs to be a clear delineation in participation and consultation processes between what the government's role is, what the private sector role is. And there is a lot of more to do to clarify this and to create the appropriate regulatory and institutional frameworks. No? It's very important that people are committed, that we raise awareness, that we deal with unconscious bias around these issues, that we know, in many countries, people are not, that are dealing with these issues, they don't know that actually they have indigenous communities in their countries. So there is something about that. And yesterday also the call that it's about us to go and do it. That is very important. But we know that public administration don't work only like that. There needs to be something like management tools, methodologies, how to go about identifying who is an indigenous community and who not, and how to bring in indigenous peoples in that conversation rather than decreeing that through a regulation. So there is a lot of things to do around the world. And so we have a bit more experience in Latin America, because there we get the most of requests for support and work. But that the issues exist really around the world. And we have 90 countries more or less where we can say that their indigenous peoples live there. So this is a great number of countries and a lot of work to do. So what we do, 3 examples here. For instance, we worked with Peru a couple of years ago. They were the first ones to have actually legislation for consultations. The issue of absence of regulatory frameworks for consultation is a big issue, and often the stumbling block is that there is no confidence to come up and build together a regulatory framework that works for everyone. So, because if you want to do a law on prior consultation, you're going to consult that law with indigenous peoples. Otherwise, you're not going to go there and build the confidence. And so many times it's used that regulation will be a restriction of these rights, but on the other hand, it's also needed to protect the rights of indigenous peoples, so that not everything hangs at the level of the highest courts in a country. Administrations need to have regulatory guidance of what is their duty, what is a civil servant to do. And if they're not doing what to do, the communities need to have the right to go to court. Right now, we have Convention 169 ratified in most of the Latin American countries, but the only level to litigate is it litigated at the highest level of constitutional law, because consultation is a constitutional right, which has year-long litigation paths and creates a lot of legal uncertainty for everyone. It's for human rights and it's for the interest of companies. There is insecurities there. So I think the issue of regulation is a very contentious one, but right now we're going through a phase in Latin America where the highest courts strike out regulations on this that are not statutory laws, because they're saying it's a right, constitutional right, that need to have a statutory law on that, which means that the mining sector has some issues there. It creates legal insecurity. At the same time, there is deadlock in many countries about this. So this is about building trust, creating an enabling environment, needs everybody at the table. I think conversations like this here are really, the proof that it's possible to come together. And what we heard over and over again, this I would say, leitmotif that if the community is well, everybody is well. I think this is something that we need to push further in that discussion. In Colombia, we work, for instance, about not us building or someone coming building the capacity, but assisting and supporting indigenous nations to build their capacities is very important. So in Colombia, we are supporting a body that's called the Special High-Level Instance of Indigenous Peoples in Colombia. That's an umbrella organization that is monitoring the state's obligations under the peace agreement, and in particular the ethnic chapter that embraces the UN Declaration Convention 169 and saying that everything needs to be dealt cross-cutting across the peace agreement in terms of economic development, but also political rights, land rights, etc. So we are working with this umbrella body to build capacity on these issues. And finally, we are also right now also implementing a project in the Andean countries with the support of the government of Spain, also an OECD country, by the way, who has ratified Convention 169, has no indigenous peoples right now. I'm saying right now because maybe somebody is going to self-identify. But they still use 169 in their development cooperation. They are guided by the principles of the convention in their foreign relations. So there is really an interest. So, and Spain is supporting us to work in Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia, actually, to build up mechanisms for participation and strengthening related capacity in this regard. So this is a few things. Very recent, and this is the closing slide. We have something that's new in the ILO because we are a tripartite organization. We've made an our governing body and General Assembly. You have government, workers, and employers. So we have the private sector sitting there, the workers. And often when we work with indigenous peoples, they say, well, where are we at the table? No, so we are also thinking about that. So we have a resolution from our conference, our highest body from last year, that said actually that the ILO should also endeavor, the words were very carefully chosen, endeavor to work towards creating a mechanism for dialogue with indigenous peoples on just transition. So this is again in the just transition discussion, including the energy transition. We see a necessity to strengthen the dialogue with indigenous peoples across the board, including at the ILO itself. And we are holding a first dialogue on just transition in Brazil later in the year in Belém, which we will host also the COP, the climate change COP next year. So this will be an exciting opportunity for us to start a dialogue with between indigenous peoples and our constituents as an organization, which are governments, workers, and employers. So it's not gonna be a dialogue between our constituents, and we invite 2 or 3 indigenous persons to say what they think about that, because we have done that a lot, I have to say. So there is also some there's some mind shift and some paradigm shift that we see in our own constituents, but it will be indigenous peoples taking the lead, sharing, and first the constituents listening and then engaging in a dialogue. So maybe next year we can share with you how that happened, how it worked out. But I think what we see here is really the proof that it can be done. And I think this is really what I wanted to share with you here. Thank you so much.
Miigwech, it's so am I allowed to just say Martin? Perfect. I'm usually like in Canada, as we know. But Miigwech Martin, it was wonderful to hear your perspectives. And it really reminded me of kind of those holistic approaches and really thinking about, we're talking about environment, but really environment has to do with everything. And even in our own government systems, we kind of end up siloing, right? So we're separating mines from Indigenous relations, and then health and economic development, but it's actually all kind of part of one system. And so we need that type of thinking to do that. And those partnership relationships, I think, in Canada are so important because what's different here, and not everyone is a treaty person, so I'm not speaking kind of in generalizations, but the treaties are really important here in Canada. And it's going back to that relationship where we're partners versus that paternalistic approach, right? So we're going to come back to this and say, how do we work together and make sure that it is really going back to what we committed to, which was being that partnership and that co-collaboration, which I think is what you're talking about, and trying to shift back that narrative to one that is more of an equitable one. And if we do that, I know Gimanushtai talks about this, we all win, same thing, Gimarock, the communities around here saying we can thrive if we're doing it all kind of intentionally and together. So great messaging, really appreciate that, and love to hear that kind of global expertise and then trying to figure out how do we keep that local as well. And so really excited to have Pamela and Carlos up here. Is it Carlos or Carlo? Carlos up here to share with them their perspectives. Looking forward to it.
Buenos días a todos y a todas. Mi nombre es Pamela Sandra Condori Cruz, urundia de la comunidad Santiago de Río Grande, de Chile.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Pamela Cruz. I'm from the community in Urundia community in Santiago de Antofagasta, Santiago de Chile.
Bueno, estoy un poco nerviosa, es primera vez que estoy acá. ¿Qué me trae acá?
I'm a little bit nervous, but it's my first time in Canada. But what brings me to Canada?
Bueno, ahí hay una imagen expuesta, es parte del territorio de donde yo vengo, netamente es seco, 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 y ahí nosotros las comunidades hacemos patria. Y también es importante ver este tema de lo que estamos viendo todo, y en todos estos días que he estado participando, creo que estamos hablando en un lenguaje más colectivo, macro e integral por el territorio, de las comunidades.
Well, here is a picture of where I'm from. As you can see, it's a very isolated place. And I'm very happy to be here because we all are speaking in a collective way, in a macro way, but we are we are all in the same page.
Para abordar estas temáticas en relación al papel del actor local de los pueblos indígenas, es importante poner en primer lugar el conocimiento genuino y el valor participación del primer actor, que son las comunidades, las personas que habitan en las comunidades, porque conocemos el territorio, porque somos la primera voz y sabemos qué es lo que quiere la madre tierra.
In order to address the issue of the role of communities and indigenous peoples in improving the environmental impacts of mining, it is important and imperative that the participation of the community should be the first protagonist in the governance structure, follow-up and monitoring of mining activities. It should be recognized and valued.
Los actores locales, es especial en los pueblos indígenas, poseen el conocimiento profundo, ancestral, sobre la naturaleza y el entorno que nos habitan.
Local stakeholders, especially indigenous peoples, possess deep and ancestral knowledge about nature and the environment they live in.
Al involucrar a los actores, yo lo llamo genuino, particularmente de las comunidades, donde se toman las decisiones tanto para hacer las gobernanzas, monitoreos y a las actividades en particular que realicen las mineras que se encuentran alrededor del territorio.
It is essential for the proper management of the environmental impacts by mining companies that we take part as leaders. Not only involving these stakeholders will impact positively the mining operations.
Dentro de esto, yo lo llamo como tipo receta. Hay 3 cosas que son fundamental para poder tener el involucramiento y el rol protagónico dentro de las temáticas que trabaja la minera, tanto como el Estado también. El monitoreo integral, la comprensión y los sentidos de pertinencia y las capacidades técnicas.
This is like a recipe for me, and it has 3 main components. The first one is the integrated monitoring. The second is the commitment and sense of belonging. And the third one is emerging technical capabilities.
Bueno, en el monitoreo integral, donde nos hace parte de una gobernanza, en lo que las comunidades pueden hacer este monitoreo, tanto sea a la minera no metálica y a la minería metálica, en lo cual se descubren, se hacen hallamientos, tanto como de deteriorar la naturaleza, pero también se ponen también está la conexión directa que hace a nuestra tierra.
So in the first one, the inclusion of local stakeholders in the monitoring process allows impacts to be addressed when they actually occur. The knowledge of communities about the places they live make it possible to identify changes that might go unnoticed by those who are not connected to the land.
Bueno, en las capacidades técnicas, las comunidades que están dentro del territorio están tomando el refuerzo de tener, prepararse, tanto como ambientalmente, y ver para el cuidado medioambiental, y ver en la salud de, ¿cómo se dice?, la madre tierra.
In the second item, the connection to the land generates a greater commitment from Indigenous people to the protection and sustainability of their resources. When they feel part of the process, managing environmental impacts becomes a collective effort. The participation of local and Indigenous communities ensures constant and effective monitoring.
Bueno, para poder llegar a una colaboración entre, yo le llamo 3 actores que son principales. Primeramente, el actor es las asambleas, la gente de la comunidad, la gente que vive en el territorio, y el otro actor es el Estado, y el tercer actor que es las empresas que llegan a explotar el mineral que se encuentra dentro de nuestras riquezas, dentro de nuestra madre tierra.
There is actually 3 main stakeholders in this whole process. The first one is the community, and they want mutual agreements and recognition of rights. The second one is the government or the state, and the third one it's effort between the other two, which is biodiversity protection.
Ya, dentro de estos 3 actores, para poder llegar a una colaboración mutua que sea llevadera entre ambas, se firman o se acuerdan acuerdos que sean beneficiosos para la comunidad, para el territorio y también para la región a nivel país.
In the first one, mutual agreements and recognition of rights, this is a collaboration between mining companies and Indigenous communities. It has been effective when both parties work to reach mutual agreements, respecting both national laws and local laws, like community laws. Practices and beliefs are also treated like a binding norms from the community to the mining companies.
Bueno, en estos acuerdos se hace realzar tanto como las leyes que corresponde al país, también se hace realzar los acuerdos de asamblea que para las comunidades indígenas prevale más que ante una ley, que es lo que nos rige a nuestros adultos mayores, que esto es llamarlo como un conocimiento ancestral que ha sido pasado generación en generación de respetar nuestros acuerdos.
And I have to emphasize here that we do recognize that the government has political laws. But also for us, what matters the most above all that political laws is our community laws. So government and companies, they should acknowledge that we prioritize our laws over the political laws, but we do respect government and policy laws.
Y adentro también está el rol del Estado, que su rol es de supervisor. También está el rol de el liderazgo de las comunidades para poder tener una buena gestión para el tema ambientalmente, para el territorio y que sea sustentable. Y obviamente que tenemos que estar involucrados en todos los procesos que se tengan que conversar. Y es importante la palabra que dicen las comunidades indígenas.
The government for us, it's like it acts actually as part of the monitoring stakeholder, but we do have, our voice has to be heard. So we really care about if they understand us or not.
Bueno, la protección a la biodiversidad, ¿qué nos hace a nosotros los indígenas estar dentro del territorio, ser los guardianes de las tierras, de lo que se está haciendo, para que no se cause un daño más a este cambio climático?
And in the third one, the biodiversity protection, We as indigenous people, we feel we protect the earth. So for us, it's very important to be considered in the whole process because we communities act as guardians of our territories, protecting essential resources.
Bueno, en el conocimiento indígena, valga la redundancia, tenemos que tener diálogo. Dentro de ese diálogo tenemos que tener entendimiento, la comunicación, pero una comunicación efectiva entre ambos actores que están involucrados dentro de cada territorio, porque no sabemos que Chile es largo, pero cada territorio tiene sus particularidades y cada territorio debemos respetarnos. Sobre este diálogo, de esta comunicación, prima el respeto, la valorización por el otro, que todos somos importantes.
We actually work on effective communication, not only with mining companies, but also within Chile. So Chile is a very long country, and we do have different communities alongside the country. We also respect the differences between our communities. And what matters for us the most is respect. We respect mining companies, but we also do respect differences within our communities and our country.
Dentro de todo esto que se habla es netamente la cosmovisión indígena, también es importante que está la ciencia, se mezcla con la sabiduría ancestral y en lo cual esto conlleva, si es que se lleva, también al tener temas en tribunales en el cuidado del medio ambiente.
But we're also talking about one important thing for communities, and is the indigenous cosmovision, the way we see the world. Community, it has to relate, and we respect also science, facts. So community science based on indigenous cosmovision has made it possible to present scientific evidence in courts and environmental assessment processes. This knowledge should not be underestimated and can be complemented with the traditional scientific method.
También en la misma cosmovisión indígena es importante que nos respeten el tema de las costumbres, tradiciones, de la forma de vida que llevan las comunidades. Y yo creo que a través de todo el mundo estamos las comunidades y tenemos la mayor riqueza, que es la médula para poder tener el desarrollo de la minería. Podemos tener todos los recursos necesarios, pero si no tenemos el involucramiento de los líderes y de la palabra de los indígenas, que es muy importante hoy en el día.
I also want to emphasize that companies and the government, they should really care about our traditions and the way we live in our communities. And we believe that we communities, indigenous communities, we have like many mining reserves in the world, and we are conscious about it. And we should work together, but they should also respect our traditions and the way we live in.
Bueno, con esto termino con el tema de decir, para nosotros en el mundo indígena, en la raza tacameña, la madre tierra es nuestra madre, que ella da para el doctor, da para la minería, da para el comerciante, da para todos. Pero ya es hora que le pongamos un poquito de valorización. ¿Y dónde está ese conocimiento? En las comunidades, en la gente, en nuestros adultos mayores, que hoy en el día es muy importante tomar su palabra, tomar el conocimiento de ellos para poder hacer estos cambios significativos, porque de verdad que llegamos con los planes hechos a los territorios y no son consultados con las comunidades indígenas. Hoy en el día es importante que ellas salgan a la voz y doy gracias por esta oportunidad de estar acá.
Finally, I would like to emphasize that if we have survived until now as indigenous peoples, it is because we have been united. Collaboration, dialogue, and mutual respect are essential to build a sustainable future. We can now allow economic interests to take precedence over the well-being of our communities and the care of our planet. Mother Earth provides for us, could provide for mining companies, could provide for the rest of our country. But it is important and imperative that projects should be done in consultation with communities. Sometimes we get projects that have already the whole plan set out, but there is a missing part, which is the community engagement piece. I invite you to reflect on the importance of integrating Indigenous peoples into the conversation about mining and the environment. Joining our efforts is key to achieving meaningful and lasting change and essential to addressing current and future environmental challenges. Thank you very much.
Nothing at all to be nervous about. Carlos, you can translate that back. Great presentation. We learned a lot, I think, was the messaging there. And brilliant, talking about that knowledge system and those, when I was talking earlier about the treaty relationship, one of the things that was very interesting when colonization happened was kind of that prioritization of Western knowledge over Indigenous knowledge. And what we're seeing now and really realizing, even in corporate, is that Indigenous knowledge systems are actually kind of weaving without us even understanding and knowing, when we talk about like leadership and our boards and how diverse perspectives at the table, those actually go back to Anishinaabe clan systems. If you've ever done any teachings on that, we can draw those relationships right there. So there's a lot of kind of brilliance, and what I want to keep at the forefront is that Indigenous knowledge systems aren't like from the past. We're contemporary people, Indigenous people. It's all woven and it's through, and just to weave that before our brilliant last speaker speaks, and I'm so excited to have Jenny Lou talk. But does anyone know why we go to school from September to June in Canada? So that's our school system. Does anyone know that piece? That actually also goes back to colonization. So when the settlers arrived here and started in the West, we were farmers. We had farming, right? Does anyone have kids? Who has kids here? What happens to them after 2 months off? Nightmares. They're little terrors. Just kidding. I was talking about Maddie. I'm kidding. She's the best human on the planet. That's why we do things for our kids. And our education system, all of the parents are like, why do we do this? They're out of routine. They're struggling. Education systems all over the world are evolving. And I'll be completely frank with you, Indigenous education systems, we're just doing it. We're just saying, you know what, this is not working for our kids, this school system. It's not working. So what we're gonna do is kids are gonna come back in the summer because it's beautiful learning that can happen. So the nations that are sovereign, that have control over their education systems are saying, we're not doing this anymore. We're gonna do this in a way, and what I envision, I hope we're having this conversation in 5 years, that the public education system is actually gonna start flipping as well. But we're doing it first. We're just doing it because we know it's not working for our kids, and we look at other education systems around the world and we're saying those are working as well. But more importantly, we're looking at our own ways of doing that we used to do before colonization to have our learners have kind of frequent breaks throughout the year. So again, these are concrete examples of things that are actually happening and how to weave that brilliant Indigenous knowledge that Pamela was talking about earlier into our system, and then it'll just be our way of doing. But it's, again, that collective way of doing together. So I'm so excited, Jenny Lou, to talk. I know we're like hyping you up. You're like, stop. Do you want to be up here? Awesome. Okay, so our last speaker, how are we doing on, we're good time? Second? Okay, perfect. All right. Welcome. Big warm welcome to our friend Jenny Lou.
Ani Bojo Minogazakinawa, Jenny Campbell, Nadishnakas, Ganapajing, Nadonjaba, Bakwadodam, Anishinaabe Indao. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jenny Lou Campbell. I am a member of Serpent River First Nation, which is a community about an hour and a half to 2 hours west of here. And I am the mining policy analyst at the Anishinaabe Nation in the Lands and Resources Department. So I'm very excited to come here and share this presentation with you. And the theme that I chose for my presentation is titled Kinegego Nabadosin. And this is 3 words that I carry with me every day in all the work that I do. And it means everything is connected. So I'm going to try to weave that through this presentation this morning. The first thing that I really wanted to open with is protocol at the Anishinaabe Nation. And this is what we open all of our meetings and our gatherings with. And they are words that guide us and also talk to the gifts that the Creator gave us. So I'm going to share this with you in the language as well as in English. So, Ngo Dwe, Wangizit Anishinaabe, one Anishinaabe family. Benjagad Gisan Anishinaaben Akin, Gibidguan Gadane Menado Waditsawin. Creator placed the Anishinaabe on the earth along with the gift of spirituality. Shkode Nebe Aki Nodin, Gibid Gostunanwi Nogdawenamong Mongpi Shkokmigong. Here on Mother Earth, there were gifts given to the Anishinaabe to look after. They are fire, water, earth, and wind. Benjagad Yiminan Getstra Wenagok Anishinaaben Wa Nogdunjin Ninda Nishwaswe Kino Madmanan. The Creator also gave the Anishinaabe 7 sacred gifts to guide them. They are Zagidwin, love, Debwewin, truth, Minadenmawin, respect, Nabrakowin, wisdom, Debwadenzawin, humility, Wakwatawin, honesty, Minwa Akadewin, and bravery. Do I need to move this over? Benjaget Kimin Gona, Debbenwe, We Nogdawendawin. Creator also gave us sovereignty to govern ourselves. Kamna Denana Gabe Shwebak, Minwa Nongo Megwa Eshwebak, Minwa Gayabe Wani Shwebak. We respect and honor the past, present, and future. So this preamble carries deep significance as it reflects the principles and responsibility that guide me as an Anishinaabe Kwe, and it guides our relationship with the land, the water, and all of its beings. So on top of these words in One Anishinaabe Family, the Lands and Resources Department also has a mission and guiding principles. So those key values are focused around capacity building within our First Nations, ensuring access to our lands and resources within our traditional territories, and even beyond that, as well as jurisdiction and treaty rights. We've heard a lot about the Robinson-Huron Treaty in recent times, so that is something that is always at the forefront as well. Environmental values. This is something that I am very passionate about because my background is in environmental sciences and engineering. So I've been able to weave the knowledge that I have gained from elders in my community and my own family members and bring it into the mining industry. Prior to joining the Anishinaabe Nation, I worked in the mining industry for 20 years. And the first thing that I always thought of on any project that I worked on was whose land is it? And I think that that is something that is often missing in projects that we work with, is it's important to understand whose land these projects are happening on and who is affected and what is their current participation level. And finally, awareness and communication. So these core values, along with Ngodwe Wangizit Anishinaabe, guide our efforts and building our relationships not only with partners in industry and government, but with each other. So a little bit about the Anishinaabe Nation, and I've tried to include some maps here just to give you some context on what I'm speaking about, because a lot of the work that I do is focused around GIS. It's something I'm extremely passionate about. It's something that I love to geek out on. So I've tried to include some really cool maps here for you guys. But the Anishinaabe Nation is comprised of 39 member First Nations, and we have a population of about 65,000 citizens. And that equates to about 1/3 of the total First Nations population in Ontario. And we are based, and so our 4 regions are based generally on historic and treaty relationships. So here on the screen, you'll see that we're currently in the Lake Huron region, Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory. This also, we also have our Northern Superior region, as well as our southeast and our southwest region. So our Anishinaabe territory is wide and vast. And another thing that I really wanted to highlight is that the Great Lakes are extremely important to First Nations, as is water. So I think when I think of mining, I'm always thinking of where the water is flowing and what communities are going to be affected. And anything that happens here in Sudbury flows into the Great Lakes, and that is what connects all of us again. So when we go back to the Kinagego and Ladosin, it's water that will connect all of us. So our nation works to coordinate common positions on nationwide issues, including governance, jurisdiction, social services, health, lands and resources, which is the department that I work in, and economic development and education. I also provide policy and analysts on federal and provincial legislations and government policy. Maybe not the tasks that I look most forward to in the work that I do. Sometimes it can be a little bit dry, reading into the Mining Act or different legislation that's coming through, but it is also very important that we provide feedback and input into those processes as they come about. Tribal groups that are represented within our nation include the Odawa, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, the Delaware, the Chippewa, the Algonquin, and the Mississaugas. So these tribal groups have interacted for countless generations and share common social, cultural, heritage, language, spiritual customs, and beliefs. Our governing structure of the Anishinaabe Nation existed long before European contact, going back to Mark's presentation in the 1492, but it was formalized through the Three Fires Confederacy. If you haven't heard about that before, I highly recommend that you look into that. All right, so now I'm going to get into some of the GIS stuff. And again, this is something that I shared that I'm very, very passionate about because I feel that this is a core capacity that is needed within First Nations. There are First Nations that are far advanced and have the GIS analysts, they have the access to the software and are doing the spatial data analysis, but there are also First Nations that have absolutely no capacity in this. So this is where I try to come in and help build that capacity within First Nations, give them access to the programming, to the training, to help empower them with the spatial data. So GIS provides First Nations with the ability to collect, analyze, and visualize spatial data, which is essential in understanding how mining operations affect our lands. By using GIS, Indigenous communities can map traditional territories, sacred sites, water resources, and sensitive ecosystems. This empowers us to assert our rights and interests more effectively by providing concrete data-based evidence when engaging with government and mining industries. So this map that I've chosen here is all of the abandoned mines that are within this region. As you can see, they are quite, there's a lot of them. There's actually 6,000 abandoned mines in Ontario, and 5,000 of those mines are within the Anishinaabe Nation. So when we're talking about the effects, the historical effects on the lands, it's important to understand that this is still out here and needs to be dealt with. So I love building dashboards. I shared that I geek out on a lot of stuff. So this is one of the dashboards that I've created recently to help just give a better understanding and a high overview of, again, abandoned mines within the Anishinaabe Nation. This is just one dashboard that I've created. There's other ones that are available on mining claims that are happening within our traditional territories, the critical mineral occurrences that are there, and there's also a more focused one on tailings. So again, as you can see here, there's just over the 5,000 abandoned mines, and I've chosen to display them based on their mine site class, with class site A being those that have the highest risks, and then class D is what Ontario has deemed to be, I guess, the lowest risk for those sites. But something that I think is important to point out here is under the closure plan widget, and you can see that majority of those abandoned mine sites did not have a closure plan. So it goes back to show that there was no environmental protections in place back in those days when those mines are operating, and that still needs to be remediated. Real-time environmental monitoring. So with this, First Nations can integrate real-time environmental monitoring systems such as satellite imagery, remote sensors, and drones, which I think is really cool. I just got my drone license. I had a little bit of an incident and flew it in my head and it got caught in my hair. So I have a little bit of work to do there. But I'm really excited to become a better pilot. These tools allow communities to track changes in land use, vegetation cover, water quality, and wildlife migration patterns caused by mining activities. By monitoring these impacts in real time, they can take immediate action if signs of degradation or pollution emerge, ensuring a rapid response to environmental threats. So the image or the map that I chose to show here is showing all of the mining claims that are currently within the Northern Superior region of the Anishinaabe Nation. And I know when Mark was up here, he was talking about some of the critical minerals that are needed right now. And if you look back at this map a couple years ago, all of that pink, there was a lot less of it. This has all happened within the last couple of years, which is really quite alarming as I mentioned, our communities are lacking capacity. And how are they supposed to keep up with the massive amounts of data that are created every day? So again, I really feel that GIS is a tool that can help empower our First Nations and give them that informed decision-making. mapping and protecting sacred and cultural sites. So for Indigenous communities, including the Anishinaabe Nation and our member First Nations, the protection of our cultural heritage is as vital as environmental stewardship. GIS allows First Nations to map sacred lands, burial sites, hunting and fishing grounds, and other areas of cultural significance. These spatial data sets are critical when assessing proposed mining activities to ensure that culturally significant areas are avoided and appropriate protections are enforced. So this map is from an old book that I had just sitting on my shelf, and I just thought it was a really great map to highlight what was happening here before mining activities were happening in Ontario in this region, and just wanted to further emphasize that we had really rich cultures, we had really vital trade networks, and minerals were a part of that. So we as Anishinaabe have been miners for millennia. Something I guess we've been working on and collaborating with FMPC, the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, and Mark mentioned this a little bit earlier, was the Spirit of the Land. And I think this is a really exciting initiative. I'm happy to be a part of the work going forward here and to start the engagement sessions and training with our First Nations on this toolkit. So again, I'll further emphasize, if you haven't downloaded it yet, please do go and download this toolkit and read it. But this was launched at the conference this year in April 2024 in Toronto, and it's a toolkit that supports Indigenous nations and communities to take the lead on assessment for projects that may have been significant, long-lasting, or irreversible impacts on our cultural rights and interests. It can be used in a regulatory or negotiation process to help address cumulative impacts of major projects. So not only mining projects, you could look at energy projects, infrastructure, and then obviously the cumulative impacts that all three of those projects may have on the land. It's important to not only think about how mining is going to affect it, but when you start layering the different activities on top of it, they are all connected. So the Anishinaabe Nation collaborated with the coalition and piloted the initial development and implementation of the tools within their communities. I'm not going to go through each one of these tools because you're all going to go and download it and read it. But there's 5 tools in here, and it's a really great resource. It points out, there's pros and cons for each tool. You can't use each tool by itself. It's meant to be used holistically and together. I think some of my last couple of slides is I pulled some of the GIS linkages that are within the toolkit itself, and some of the stuff that I'm working on is density of use and mapping high priority areas. So developing maps that depict traditional use areas, occupancy on the land, spiritual and learning and gathering sites, cultural landscape values, and travel routes can produce a visual representation of cultural rights. A density use map shows how different places are used and how crowded they are. They can show us things like where people most frequently use the land, areas people are avoiding, and can locate areas where people have noticed a lot of negative environmental impacts from industries. These maps are useful because they help us understand the land, how it is being used or not used, and help to make decisions about things like where to put a road. So if you think back to a couple slides, with the volume of mining claims or the number of abandoned mines, right there, it's highlighting land that is that we can no longer access, or land that is contaminated and could be harmful to the health not only of us, but our relatives, the plants, and the animals. And as well, mapping data showing changes over time in land use. So the compilation of cartographic and other data about land cover and use are valuable in establishing changes in habitat availability and sustainability over time. Disturbance levels where industrial, municipal, agricultural, or infrastructure developments have been introduced to a First Nations territory. The calculation of the amount of territory that is still available for quiet enjoyment of the natural environment can be critical to understanding the degree to which cultural rights are still practicable. And the presentation of these changes is inherently a visual exercise, allowing First Nations members and other decision makers to see what has been lost and what remains in a way that the written word struggles can convey. And I think this is really powerful where maps come in and can tell a story, because it allows us, of all different levels of technical knowledge, all different generations. You can print out a map and sit around a table and really have a discussion and have that visual representation in front of you. And I think that's really powerful and vital to the stories that we have to tell in regards to mining. And that's it, miigwech.
Miigwech, what a wonderful example of, again, the intentional, thoughtful work that Anishinaabe Nation's doing, but also highlighting and sharing that knowledge with other nations to be able to do that really important work. And I love that we started, and you start that everything that they do at Anishinaabe Nation is in using that protocol, that language, and it doesn't matter the department, they have that. And that's really important because we want to see that woven in. When we're talking about strategies or things working with nations, it needs to be woven into everything that you're doing. So the word even ake means land, but ake nomaj means the land as our first leader. And that means so much more, right? When you think about that and importance. I'm just going to check. Do we have a couple minutes for questions from the audience? Do we have before final thoughts? I saw. Oh, okay. I saw Minister Rickford walk in, so I just gave him like I saw him right there. So if I have just a second to summarize a few thoughts. So can I agree? A wonderful panel. Wonderful panel. Just for me, I have a little bit of duality. I love the storytelling, but I'm very practical as well. So one of the things that I like to ensure that people have some of these takeaways is whenever I'm doing work, and I credit the work of Dr. Barnard and Kirkness and Dr. Cindy Pelletier, but there's a thing called the 5 R's in Indigenous research, but they really, really resonate with anything that you're doing, whether it's in environment and education. And one, it's the project needs to be relevant. So you need to make sure you have relevance when things are happening. And I heard that theme come out. Reciprocity is key. So we need to make sure we're having those relationships that are reciprocal and moving forward. And everything we're doing, we talked about today, is responsible to the land, responsible as people. And that the relationships are really at the crux of everything that we're doing. And we added a few yesterday. We were talking about that results, accountability. How are you doing that? What does that look like? And honoring that you're going to need to, as a non-Indigenous partner and Indigenous, we need to generate that resilience together because it's going to be a new path that we want to shape for our future generations. And sometimes we have to be a little bit relentless. So that's the last one. When we're doing this work, because it's innovative and it's uncomfortable, and guess what? When we're uncomfortable, we grow. We need to live in that discomfort in order to grow and to move forward. And I'll just end with a quote in the language because it's very important. And anytime I've ever done work with a Tikmashing and Wanapate and Sagamok know this because we start every meeting and end every meeting with this quote by Alphonse Pitawanakwe that says, Jispin bawa mukit man wa yaman gawaga wika ki yazin, which means if you do not go after what you want, you'll never get it. So it's making sure that we know that we have to create that action. So miigwech for your time today. It is the greatest gift, and appreciate the panelists more than you know. So.